Well, welcome to a Christmas Eve edition of this little project I'm doing. We're joined again by Captain David Greer, who I've sort of put on a pedestal as he's given me such opportunity these last couple of weeks. But I'm wearing my Christmas PJs as a homage to my mother-in-law. But anyway, enough of that. Captain Greer, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here. Merry Christmas.
You too, sir. You too. I hope your dinner tonight with family was good.
Oh, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. It was mostly my great grandson's show. You
Yeah,
know, I mean, he's the one who got all the presents, and that was a delight.
sure. Do you get him any Green Man themed toys this
No,
year?
I got him a dinosaur that was has batteries and walks and
Okay.
opens his mouth and that sort of thing, and he was delighted with that. I think the favorite present that his mother gave him, and that was probably unwise, was a a microphone that you could do karaoke with,
Uh-huh.
and she's going to really enjoy that about 2 o'clock in the morning when he wakes up.
Without a
But
doubt.
because that's right now his favorite toy. But go ahead.
Well, we talked a little bit about it over the last week, but the three publications I've done so far with you, what kind of feedback have you gotten on those?
Oh, I've had a good friend come by and have coffee with me this morning, and we talked for an hour about it. He had watched them, and he had all sorts of questions about it, and he enjoyed it. And my family has enjoyed that. I think it's probably gonna, mean more to them later on when I'm not above ground anymore. But everybody so far, I've had some, a lot of friends and a lot of river people have told me they enjoyed it. Uh, so I think I've had some pretty positive feedback from it.
Very glad to hear it. Looking forward to seeing what kind of feedback we get on your full episode on January 20th. 2.5 hours with Captain Greer. But speaking of feedback, I've been hoping to do something like this for quite some time, uh, where I'm hoping I can get some viewer questions, some additional insights that people are looking for. And in this case, it was a previous guest of mine, Captain Kevin Jackson. He runs Z drives for Marquette on the lower.
Yeah, I watched his interview with you, part of it anyway. It
Good
was
deal.
good. He's sounds like a pretty sharp young man.
Well, he had some comments that I have shared with you previously, but that I'd like to read on the podcast. I had asked him if he'd been watching the features I made with you this week, and he said, and I quote, "This is the type of man that I could listen to for hours. So much knowledge and history of what we do. It certainly hit the spot when he said that his stepson might not want to do this job anymore if they start having kids. This job is very hard for a family man, and you have to be mentally stable. And even then, a lot of the men out here are going through mental issues that aren't discussed. I'm actually working on a book that speaks on these things. This man, David Greer, is a gem."
Well, that's very kind of him to say, but he's right. It's good insight. That that job is not. It's not for everyone. It really isn't. Uh, and I've thought about this so much over the course of the last 40 something years, is that whether or not we choose our professions or they choose us, and maybe a little bit of both. There's a lot of luck involved, and if you wind up after you finish your career pretty satisfied with what you've done, with how you've spent your life, then you probably chose pretty well. And I've certainly felt that way. I still feel that way. I'm very pleased with the career that I've had. It's very satisfying to think back on it and look at it. But with anything, any kind of job, any profession, there's probably a certain amount of pathology involved in it. You know, it may very well have been that I wanted to get on a boat to get away from some of those wives I've had. I'm kidding, of course, but there may be some truth in that. But whatever it was, I enjoyed and probably have all my life have enjoyed being alone. I'm not an extrovert. I'm surprising myself that I'm so valuable in these interviews here, but I'm, I, uh, I enjoy and always have enjoyed being by myself, and uh, I've enjoyed my own company. I've sometimes it's been tedious and boring, and sometimes it's been lonely, but I don't feel loneliness at this stage in my life that a lot of people probably do. I've got friends, I know a couple of old friends who are widows now, and they're just terribly lonely. They're just not used to living their lives without that that close partnership. And I'm doing just fine. A couple of cats and I'm okay. But I spent 40 something years basically sitting in a glass house looking out at the river. And look, I never cared. I didn't give a damn about boats and barges. I never have. You know, it was the river that I loved and I found interesting, and as an object or a subject of contemplation, it has been worth my time. Uh, there's something meditative about it that some people may or may not discover. They may not find that. A lot of people, it's more hurtful, more harm. I've known a lot of unhappy old men who did this job, who they stayed on boats all the time. They I guess they wanted a bunch of toys, whether they needed a bunch of toys or it cost them. It was difficult to support their families, and they worked a lot. They spent a lot of time on boats, and uh, their kids grew up without really knowing them very well, and they lost the sense of their wives, or they grew apart. uh, I can think of one old man, and this has been 60 years ago. He and his wife met when they were young, and the heat of passion, had two or three babies, and he worked on the river, and then discovered that they hated one another, and they spent the rest of the poor old man's career, him on boats and she at home, living together for the sake of the kids. But both of them were two utterly miserable individuals. And I remember that he died of cancer. He was dying of cancer basically the last trip he made on the boat. And he stayed long enough to go home and die. And I thought that was such a sad story. If you don't care deeply about what you're doing for a living, then your life's going to be miserable. You're going to hate it. You're going to hate yourself, and you shouldn't do it. If there's any other way, I don't. I've tried to make my granddaughters understand that you need to find more than half of your life is going to be spent making a living, and try to do something that nourishes you, that enriches you, that makes you feel like you're accomplishing something, that that adds meaning to your life if you can. If you can't find that, that's you're apt to be a sad person. And I don't know. Does that answer your question?
I think it does fairly well. I had a thought. You mentioned in our first meeting, I think, that once you got your degree, you were pretty sure that you'd be teaching for a career.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you find that maybe this podcast scratches that itch?
It probably does. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. I don't know. Another itch that it scratches also is I grew up in rural Mississippi, more or less, and the people I was around, the adults I was around, were very much in the American oral tradition. They were storytellers. I can remember sitting at the barber shop, and the old barber, my barber had his father had cut and shaved my great grandfather's hair. And he had been there all of his life at that one barber shop. And when I came in, he got me in that chair. That was going to be an hour haircut because he was going to hold forth. And I loved it. I was around that. And when I first went to work on the river, those were the kind of people I got to know. Those were the people who were older than me, who were my father's generation, who just told wonderful tales, and I think that was one of the reasons that I stayed because I just really like hearing their stories. It didn't happen as often anymore. I mean, when I was a young pilot, I was always going off on another channel and listening to some of those old timers talk. I loved that. And towards the end of my career, the last few years, I didn't hear much of that. I didn't hear very good stories. There were a few that could still tell a tale, but when I first went out there were some real characters. So yeah, there's that, and then there is that sense of I've lived a life that's probably worth thinking about or talking about and teaching people if anybody wants to learn. I don't know that there are a lot of people around anymore who are really, maybe just a few, like the young man that you mentioned, who are interested in that kind of thing. I don't find that most Americans, even people in that industry, are particularly interested in the history, which is a shame because in the last 50 years we lived in America in a kind of renaissance in the study, the discipline, the research, the writing of history. We really have. Most people haven't noticed, but that's because of computers. Because we have all the information that is available, can be made available, finds its way somewhere into that cloud, and it always will. If you're a politician and you think you're getting away with something, you might better think again. The verdict of history is going to tell you, it's going to trail you because it's just we because of that. Even if we come to live in an authoritarian society where they don't allow you to write history, it's not going to go away, and that's I think most Americans don't know their history, don't much care about it.
Well, this little podcast is my best effort to throw everything I can about the industry to the American public. I'm hoping it gains some reach, but
I hope so.
um,
Yeah, I appreciate what you're doing there, and I hope you get more people who are involved in it. Uh, there was a book here recently that Melanie Golding put together, and I met her, I saw her, and I've known Steve there. I tripped for him one time years and years ago, and I visited with him at one of those pilots meetings that we had in Lake Village, and she told me about the book she was doing, and I intended to interview for her. I think, and I wound up not doing it. But you might find that book if you can, because there's a lot of people who she interviewed for that who I don't. Some of them may not be around, you know, or may not be around much longer. And there's some pretty good stories in that too.
Well, in the process of doing this podcast, I actually heard about that book. It's called Life Between the Levees. It's available still, but
Yes.
another of my guests had mentioned it, and I reached out. There was some communication there. Um, I'm eager to take a look at that book myself. But did you find towards the end of your career on the water that you were that storyteller on the radio at night? Were people interested out there on the water for situations like you grew up in?
If somebody asked questions or came to me with it, the young man that I rode with uh, last couple of trips I made there, Jeremiah was interested in the stories that I told, and I enjoyed talking about stuff with him. But I don't think I counted uh, very many of them that were all that interested, which is a shame. A lot of there's a lot of good stuff's been lost. In just recent years from not listening to old people like me.
Well, did you find that, if I may, shooting the shit on the radio was less common towards the end of your career?
I found it boring. I mean, when I first started in a pilot house, you could hear someone talk, and I swear you could tell where they were from. If they were from Greenville, or Vicksburg, or Natchez, or New Orleans, or Monkey's Eyebrow, Kentucky, wherever, because of their accent, the words that they use. That was fascinating to me to listen to that, and over a period of years, that kind of flattened. You heard what you hear on the radio now is mostly cliches. It's as if they're communicating, but they're communicating out of a can or something. And that's not just on the river. That's pretty much everywhere. I was sitting at a Starbucks a few years ago in Memphis, and there's this young couple sitting at a table next to me, and I was listening to them. They were college students. Obviously, they each had copies of the Proust book, Swan's Way. I don't know if you've ever read it or not, but he was. This is, even in English translation, this is one of the most complex, one of the richest uses of language that you'll ever encounter in this book. And it's hard to read. I mean, you've got sentences that are pages long, you know, and so you've got to listen to it and pay attention to what you're reading, and it's the idea is trying to recapture the past in this book. And here's this young couple. They obviously don't know. They probably in the same class, but they don't know each other very well. And I swear, I'm thinking they sounded like, listening to their conversation, it was like listening to people who were texting one another. Monkeys. I mean, the could use sign language, and fashion a more intelligent conversation than what I was listening to. And I just thought that was enormously uh, ironic. And I think that's something of that. Well, I think there's been an inflection point, a shift in in human cognition within the last 30 years. And it's not it like very much. It reminds me, as a historian, looking back at the 15th century, where you have the invention of the printing press, which changes the way people think. And you have the Protestant Revolution, and then you have the voyages of discovery, And after the 15th century, you don't have the same kind of people living in Europe, you know. And I think there's something of that about our culture. It fascinates me. I don't have any answers for it, but it's interesting to me. And I'm going a long way around here talking about this. Probably nobody's interested in what I'm saying here, but I think that loss is evident, and listening to people talk on the radios on boats, just like it is everywhere else in American culture. Does that
Well,
answer the question?
well, Cap, if nobody watching or listening cares about what you just said, that's okay, because I do.
Well,
Um,
that's I'm glad you do.
Getting back to the plan here with Captain Kevin Jackson.
Yeah, go ahead. He had a series of questions. I'll answer them for him.
He responded to me, and I'll do this in sections. But he said it would be good to know about how the wheelmen navigated different sections of the lower back in your day that ran a different way back in those days. Like Island 8 used to run behind the island, and I always wondered how they even did it because that turn is sharp. There's a few turns like that on the lower that now run a different way today.
Well, I wasn't around when there was the actual channel on the three states side of Island 8. And it may look like a pretty good turn, but back in the day, I forget what stage of river excuse me, we had to have to run it. It took a pretty good bit of water to run that behind Island 8. It was a long way around too. It'd take you longer to go around the backside of Island 8 than it did to go around the channel side. And because it was just a longer way. You would come in kind of close to the island. There was a sandbar on the right descending side towards the foot of the island, and it's deeper towards the island. And so you'd come in towards the island, and then you'd widen out into about the middle of the river, as I recall. And pretty much all the way or up around there and around the turn that he's talking about until you got up towards Three States Towhead, and then you'd have to, I think you had to run between two towheads up there, if I remember correct. It's been a long time ago. It's a long time since I've been in behind that. And it really wasn't much of a turn. That wasn't much of a turn right there. But back in the day, there's a place called, and he knows where I'm talking about. It's called Battle Axe. And I don't know, it's probably because the river looks on the radar looks like a battle axe, but there's a big trail dike now that cuts off the bend of that, and you run now on the trail dike on the left descending side of the trail dike. But back in the day, we used to run behind that. We'd go down that, we'd come off Bordeaux Point and go over there on that right descending shore, and we would have to go down that shore very close, right, a little kind of towards where the trail dike is now. And at False Point, you had to get by, but it was close. You always had to back up there, almost always, that I remember. Uh, there, I don't know. I'm sure in high water you could steer it, but I don't remember. But I can remember backing up there 1,000 times, and it was not an easy flank. You had to be really careful because of the draft in there. You really kind of had to shape that shore and force it down on that shore, uh, you know. And I can remember backing it up with those when I was with ACBL, with those old bobtail 6200s that had the Alco engines in them that smoked. They were locomotive engines, was what they were when ACBL was owned by CSX Corporation. And I guess when they built those boats, Jeff Boat did, they had a whole bunch of train engines left over and they put them in those boats. and they smoked. They were terrible about smoking. And I mean, it was so big old black smoke. And you'd go down in that hole down in there, and it was like going down in a hole, really, back down that shore. And you'd back up, and you couldn't see anything. You'd back and back and back, and then you'd have to shut the engines off of the smoke clear to see where you were and what kind of shape you were in. It was miserable, but you always had to plank. And I was riding one trip, oh, with Ralph Hudson, Stubby Hudson, they called him, on the old Bill Elmer. Stubby did not back up. Very seldom. He was not going to plank. He just wasn't going to do it. And if he did it didn't look pretty. He could do it, but he didn't like it. And I watched him steer that place. I think that was where it was. And I was sitting up there. I wanted to see what he did, because he changed watches up above there, And I came back up after dinner and watched him do it. And man, it would have been hard for me to stick 30 barges out on that sandbar as far as he did. He had the eye though. He had it out there. And you mentioned Dave, the shower, Dave and Dave. There, I bet Dave Showers steered it. He's the kind of pilot who could do that. Stubby was too. And but I swear that false point there at the lower end, if you'd been on the stern of that boat, you could have stepped off on the bank, And he didn't even get up out of his damn chair, It was just phenomenal, I thought. And Stubby been around a long time. Slow talking, never got excited about anything funny. Oh man, he had a great sense of humor. But I sat there and watched him do it, and after he got shoved out, I said, "Well, Captain Ralph, I thought I could steer a boat, but I'm pretty sure I can't. I couldn't do that." And he just laughed. And he said, "No, no, no, you do a good job planking. You keep that up. You keep doing that." And I said, "I learned to do this when back in the old days when you didn't have all these revetments, when you had a mud bank and you had so many crossings and so many turns. You'd come out of one crossing and one bend and go into another one. I was just thinking about that question before we started. This is a 1947 light list. And this is what it looks like. You can fit it in your back pocket. And it'll show you, all these crossings, the lights. You see so many more lights and day boards and everything that marked the river at the time. And he learned to do that. And of course, he said, we hit the bank, we just bounce off and keep going. And I said, if you did sink a barge, nobody really cared all that much, and so I didn't get to see that river. But the river I did get to see, there were a lot of turns where, you had, you may have to back up 2 or 3 times to get out of that bend, or make a crossing. And there was an example of that is below Memphis at Tunica, actually. Now that goes all the way down that shore from Tunica, way for miles down that shore. Used to, we had to cross the river about 3 times before we could make that. We had it right there at Buck Island. You had a dog leg that carried you across to Swopes, and it was a big old long dike out in the middle of that with a strong set down on that dike. So you had to back up and try to stay off that dike. And then between the dike and the next turn at Swopes, you didn't have a whole lot of room. You had to get You had to get your headway up, push out so you wouldn't run over that dike, and then you had to get stopped again or checked down again to current speed once you got to slopes and flank that. And then you could usually steer from slopes over to Commerce. But from there, you had to go down to Peters there, and that was another place where you really had to watch what you were doing. You usually often you had a strong set down on that shore there. And there were just all kinds of places. If it's like somebody said, if you came on watch at midnight at Inslee Towers there at Memphis, below Memphis, there at the mouth of McKellar Lake. If you came up those steps and you heard those windshield wipers slapping, those sorry windshield wipers. They could put good windshield wipers on a Greyhound bus, but they couldn't seem to find one for a towboat, and you had those, they'd be slapping, and you knew you had a long night ahead of you because there were so many crossings and tight turns that you had to make there. And it was just hard work. We really got a workout when I first started, learning how to do that. And I started with Canal Barge Company, and when I started, they were mostly running unit tows. I was on the largest one of them and the sorriest boat probably, but it was still a unit tow. But then they started barge lining, and I can remember making the crossing. You had to come down up at Gold Dust above Osceola, Island 30. You had a dog leg. You had to go down by Gold Dust. You had a dog leg over to Fletcher Dykes, I think it was. Then another dog leg over to Keys Towhead, and then another dog leg down to Kate Aubrey Upper, and then you had another dog leg down there at that shore all the way down to Osceola that you had to flank. And I remember one time following I was on the old Susan Lane, which was probably a 3,200 boat, horsepower boat with 20 barges. And I was following the Miss KD. I had come on watch, and my partner had me way too close to him. And there was that Miss KD in front of me with 40 barges. And the Miss KD backed up. He basically stopped 40 barges in a tow length at Kate Aubrey Upper. And I couldn't have stopped those 20 barges between there and Greenville. I could never have stopped them, those. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I just prayed that you'd go ahead and get it flanked out of there and move it on down the shore before I got there. And he did somehow. But you had a lot of difficult river back in those days. And after the 90s, they started putting a lot of rock, building dikes, revetments and everything. And they changed the river pretty dramatically over a period of several years, the time mostly when I was in South America. But yeah, so there were a lot. I can think of a whole bunch of places where we don't even go now that were it was hard work just to get down through those places. Yeah.
Well, in that regard, do you find that the skills of reading the river uh, have fallen by the wayside at all since the advent of Rose Point and systems like that?
Yeah, he asked that question, and I do. I mean, there's a reason for that. My observation over the course of my career and watching the people who came before me is that every tool that we gain, to navigate, it distances us from the reality of the river. I've worked with people who they didn't have any, they'd run that river at night without without radar, any of that stuff, with a searchlight, that carbon arc searchlight, that you're not going to see very far with that little searchlight, and then once they got radar after World War II, all those old captains I worked with, come daylight, man, turn that off. Let's save that radar. It wasn't saving it; it was doing just the opposite. But they turned that radar off, and man, I had gotten by then where I couldn't operate without a radar. I had to use the radar daytime and dark, basically to help me judge distance. And so that particular tool had really, I was aware of this, that it had distanced me from, the subject of my observations, from the river itself, from reality. And I think that's true for everybody, I mean, in the modern world, that all these tools, these luxuries that we create for ourselves. I mean, if you're going across a bridge at 70 miles an hour, you're not noticing your surroundings. I mean, it's not even scenery, the river itself. If you're crossing in a ferry, it is, it's something a little bit different. And so that modern life insulates us from the realities that our grandparents and great grandparents lived. That's true, whatever you do, but it's certainly true on the river. Is man, I wish we had Rose Point or something like it when we were in South America. Because man, we had 2,000 miles of river to learn, and we might not even have a chart that was less than 25 years old, and that was hard work, because you really had to pay attention to the river itself. You really had to learn it, and some of that learning was going to be by by running a barge aground out on a sandbar or something. There's an old story I've heard about, a port captain's looking to hire a pilot, and he's interviewing two or three guys, and everybody he interviews talks about what good pilots they are, never had an accident. I'm this and I'm that. They're bragging on themselves. Now, I've met a lot of people like that who've never gotten aground, never watched a tow break up or anything like that. But then the last guy that comes in, said about that. He asked him. He said, "Oh, hey, oh yeah, I've run over everything in the river. I know where it is." That's the one he hires.
If I can try and test your memory, see if you can't paint a picture for me. Can you walk me through a trip below Thomas Point, coming around Thomas Point, all the way down to Myrtle Grove? What
We
is
talked.
it? What is it you're watching for? What fleets do you transit? What do you each step of the way? Can you do that for me?
Yeah, I can tell you that, and we've talked about this before. Uh, I think in that Sunshine Bridge thing, I kind of painted a picture of a river from hell, in high water, because it is. Uh, this is there's a book I've got. I'll show it to you. It's in Spanish. It's about uh, turning South American rivers, and South America has the most generous, you know, watersheds in the world. Really, they have the Amazon, they have the the Orinoco. They have the Paraná, the Paraguay, and the Magdalena. And when we were in and I think I told you this, I'm not sure where, working in I got hold of this. We're in Venezuela, and I looked at it, and they're talking about turning all of these rivers through canals and constructions of some kind into one great waterway, you know, commercial waterway. And oh, what a great thing that would be to them. And I thought to myself, first of all, there's nobody in South America has enough money to build something like that, much less to sustain it, you know. And what imbecile would think about turning, a continental river systems into a drainage ditch for boats, and cargoes and commerce and money and all that? It had to be insane. And I thought, well, who would do that? And people would do that or us. The chart we were using in Venezuela was from an original survey made by the United States Corps of Engineers, USGS, and equivalent agencies in South America, with the notion of turning a canal that basically fed both the Rio Negro, which was one of the major uh, rivers in the Amazon basin, and the Orinoco. They were talking about building a canal and channelizing the Orinoco in those days because German submarines were sinking all the rubber ships, you know. And you can't run an army without rubber, or you couldn't in those days. They didn't do it, but America entered the war, and the Germans called hell. But you you think about people. Why would people think something like that they could do something like, or that they ought to? Well, we still do. And that river between Thomas Point and the head of passes is exactly such a river. The last high ground is right there at Baton Rouge. And from there on down, you've got nothing but delta mud, you know. Now, the last time the Mississippi changed course and sought a quicker way to the Gulf was 500 or 600 years ago, and that was when it cut off the Lafourche Delta and took the one it presently has. Well, this is, of course, we're serving the whole nation. This is extremely, one of the busiest, probably the busiest port in the world. A good 60% or better of export grains come down the Mississippi in barges and find their way to ships and to other countries. It's the chemical and corridor. You have this big complex in Baton Rouge, this Exxon refinery, and you have refineries and plants and docks and facilities all up and down the river, and you're talking about enormous sums of money. But then, I mean, I think it was back in 2011, I guess it was, when it really struck me with how insane this is. When I was coming up the bank at I don't remember really what town it was. There's across from St. Elmo and Paulina. There's down that shore. You got a light they call Crescent Light, and you don't want to be down on that shore in high water meeting anybody. because the set down on that bank was so hard. But I was above there. I was coming up below ACBL's fleet there, and I had to kind of lay in on below the fleet, right on the levee, and I'm looking over the levee down at some guy sitting on the porch drinking his coffee, you know, looking up in the air at me. And going right by me are these ships. And there's nothing between him and an earthen levee, nothing between him and the America's great continental river and the whole runoff, of the Mississippi River, but an earthen levee. And I thought that this is insane. Would you live in a place like that? Would you feel comfortable living in a place like that?
I grew up in a place like that.
Yeah, well, I'd want to think about it. And you think of all the commerce, the traffic that goes on the river. You've got ships, you've got these huge tows, big as a 5 acres farms or bigger. Then you've got these little guys with small oil tows or anhydrous ammonia barges or whatever that have come out of the canals, that they don't know anything about running in the current, and they don't really know where they are, some of them, but they've got to meet all these giant vessels that can't stop for them and can't get out of their way, and you've got anchorages, and in high water, man, some of these ships go back and forth, on their anchors. And then you've got these huge fleets that break away from time to time. You've got foreign flag ships that burn bunker C or heavy fuel, that have to run slow, and sometimes they lose power like they did at Riverwalk that time, and all sorts of things could happen. People ought to, they meet a river pilot, they ought to pat him on the back, because those guys do a pretty good job. There haven't been any disasters. Nobody's run in and cut a chlorine barge in half, and killed uh, half the students at LSU or anything like that. That hasn't happened. But it's not a system that, it's one that it's okay with us, as long as we can sustain it. But my concern is that it's just more than a little bit crazy, that so much depends on such a fragile, flawed system. And we don't know that. We don't see that. We trust that everything's just fine. And we've been lucky. We've never had these great tragedies like they had in Bhopal, India, where, well, you've had refineries blow up, but nothing terrible has happened to us. And then you have nature that is changing pretty dramatically. You have you hear climate change. Climate change is just one facet of what environmental people who really know environmental stuff are talking about. They're talking about planetary boundaries, and climate change is one of those boundaries. And it is changing. If you haven't noticed, then you haven't been paying attention. If you haven't noticed that the ocean is hotter, more acidic, and full of microplastics, huge garbage dumps in the oceans, that we're in the middle of what they call a sixth extinction, that species are dying out at a dramatic rate, and that the phosphorus nitrate balance in our farming is and that we are depleting reservoirs of water, particularly in the West. We've been building golf courses in Las Vegas and Reno and Phoenix and places like that for a very long time. And the aquifers, may probably will never certainly not in our lifetimes recover from that, even if something fortunate happens. You got all this stuff. Plus we have a very such a we have had such a fortunate geography in the United States. No other country has this, that we have actually had this navigable river that runs right straight through from top to bottom through the richest agricultural lands in the world. But we fudged against protecting that. We environmental laws are really bad for big business, and a lot of their resources go to preventing them from being enforced or going on the books, so that you've got, it's legal to dump, pig manure into the Des Moines River to the extent that it can overpower the water treatment plants in Des Moines itself. You've got all this stuff coming down the river, and this is happening all over the globe, where you've got these enormous dead zones, in the oceans where nothing can live. And all of this stuff is, stuff that we really don't pay any attention to. So when you navigate from Baton Rouge to the head of passes there, first of all, it's the hardest work you'll ever do as a river pilot, is navigating that in high water. It is, because the currents are all confined within those levees, and you've got all of the commerce and the industry on all up and down the river taking up space, and you've got currents that are so complex. They really are. You come off Wilkerson Point at in Baton Rouge, you've got in high water, you got to back up there. You can't steer it, because basically, first of all, it's going to speed up the current when you come off the point, because you've got a river within a river, and these gigantic eddies hemming them in, and a bridge down below there. And it's a very dangerous, place there. But you've got it's challenging, and I think we're not noticing, and I don't see that the industry that the industry that uses that river seems to be particularly concerned about it. I am. I mean, I don't think it can, over a period of time, given the changes, and if we continue to use resources like we're using them, I don't think that can be sustained. What else you want me to
Well, I
lecture?
know I know we've opened the spillways here more frequently the last couple of years with high water. Um, what dangers do you see? You mentioned previously with me the area of Southern University. I mean, if we overtop those levees, that's
That's not a levee. Southern University is on high ground.
well, no, that area of Baton Rouge is kind of
Yeah,
what I'm referring to.
I don't know. Levee breached in 1949. You know, and I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody really knows what could happen, and we don't know what kind of weather we're going to get. Are we prepared for extreme, a 1,000-year flood. I don't know. Sooner or later we're going to get one. I mean, have you read John Barry's book about the 1927 flood?
No, I have not yet.
You should read that, because he talked to a man who's retired. I mean, I'm sure he's still around, with the Army Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg, who basically gave him some pretty good explanations of how a river works during a flood like that. And it just kept building and building, pulse after pulse, of floods from different areas, different places. And it's really kind of such a complex and remarkable, phenomenon. And that was pretty unusual for that time. I mean, we'd never had a flood quite like that. And they say that we've had record floods because you've had record river levels, but I don't know that means the same thing, in 2011 that it meant in 1927. I don't know, but sooner or later I I mean, I'll put it this way: I don't think we're prepared for something like that. I really don't, and I don't think the Corps of Engineers is. I mean, I admire them enormously, some of the work that they've done, but they're a creature of Congress. They're creatures of power, you know, and they're going to bow to that. They're going to do what corporations and billionaires want more than they're going to listen to a river pilot. Uh, and that concerns me. I think we know too much. We know more. We think we know more than we actually know, and that's my concern. I don't see it. That whole system as being sustainable in the future. I hope it is. Maybe may work out just fine, but my intuition is that it's not.
Well, I'm glad you're here to offer those thoughts because they're not any that I would have ever thought to have. But can we finish this one this evening? Walk me down to Myrtle Grove from Thomas Point. Anything that comes to mind from your memory of those trips.
Well, you get down below Geismar. That's the combat zone, is what we call that. Because there's so much stuff happening there, so much traffic, and so little room, and the currents are so vicious down that way that and when you've got a big raft of barges, you that those things aren't easy to navigate. You've got to try to position them in such a way that you let the current do the work. you know and you've got other people around you who they need the same river. Ships and big tows, they have a hard time. They work together pretty well, I think. But in places like that, you come off Philadelphia Point, then you've got 81 Mile Point, and it is a vicious turn. Great big old eddy up in the bend, dead water up underneath the point, another eddy. And it's you got to be in shape. It's hard to get in shape for that turn before you get there. It's best if you can, kind of straighten out from Philadelphia Point, and so that you've got the current on the right side when you get to 81 Mile Point. And that's kind of hard to do. Sometimes you wind up with the current on the port side instead of the starboard side, and then you've got to back up and get that your stern around towards the point, And if you overdo it on that point and overflank, you got it's a hard, you got huge fleets down that shore, and trying to stay off of them and get out of their way is hard to do. And you're liable to have a couple of tows up in the bend on the shore, the right descending shore, doing tow work, and boats everywhere. And somehow you got to get down by them. And then you've got to get in shape to make Brangier Point, which is another set of problems, navigating it. And once you get around there, you've got to set up a Point Homeless, which is a whole different, set of of uh, of of, things you have to do to stay in shape. Uh, and then you get down to that, you get through Sunshine Bridge, and you've got boats lined up down that right descending shore to do pickup barges out of Zeno, out of the fleets down there, and some of them they'll be drafted. They got a current that'll draft that head out right there where you are, and if you got ships at Burnside Anchorage, they're liable to be out there. It's just, and then if you've got some poor fellow who's trying to get up the river, and you got to meet him somewhere, you run out of room so quick, and it takes so much room, and to steer those things, because you're if you get you're steering with, you got your head up on that point there, and it's setting you down in the bend, and you got all that stuff in the bend, and you got this big eddy just above Zeno grain, and that'll catch you and drag your head over in there. A lot of people, and I've done this with big toes, I just back up everywhere. I go all the way down the river, flanking, basically, so that at least I'm slowed down, so that maybe I'm not running over somebody. Maybe they'll run over me, but I don't have to run over somebody, or run them out of my way or whatever, just to try to keep control of that river. And it is miserable all the way down, you know. It slacks off a little bit when you get down below New Orleans, below Algiers Lock, down in that way. Some of those turns, they're not quite. You got bank to bank river for one thing, you know. It used to be. I mean, I think they work with us a little better now. You have Discipline Pilots Association. We used to joke that the difference between one whistle and two whistles to a crescent ship pilot was about the width of a ship. If you met him, you're going to meet him in the middle of the river, whether you want it to or not. And sometimes you need it. If you've got 30, 35 barges, you needed more than the middle of the river. And it's just, plus you've got these radios that are constantly blaring. You can't tell who's talking to you where. And you'll pick up shrimp boats out in the Gulf speaking Vietnamese or something, and they've got better radios than anybody. You can't hear the ship right around the corner, but you can hear this guy in the shrimp boat way out in the Wrigley's or somewhere. So it's just, oh man, I'm pretty sure that section of river, has caused more heart attacks among river pilots than any other.
Interesting that you mentioned the Vietnamese fishing boats. I work currently in Triangle's fleet office, on the river,
Oh, really?
and we have active radios listening to the fleet, and they were on our channel 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was all
Oh,
day. They could not
oh.
hear us. They could not hear us either.
I worked on a boat one time with a fella, a Vietnamese guy who had actually been in the army for the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese. He's a nice guy, very quiet and everything. But he came up in the pilot house one night, and he was listening to these people, and he just grabbed the handset and said something to them in Vietnamese, and it shut them up. Yeah, I don't know what he said, but he straightened them out. It'd be nice to have him around all the time. I don't know what he promised to do to them, but at least he probably made them ashamed of making so much noise. There, but yeah, you got that. You got that problem. I guess all the way up and down the coast, you do.
Well, finally here tonight, are you familiar with the RC Crapel incident and the cooperative spirit from, I believe, 2021?
I don't think so. I've heard something about it, but I don't know much about it. I don't know anything about it really.
Well,
I may have heard something about it, but I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember.
yeah, I did an episode on it actually with the sister of one of the mariners that we lost. I'll
Oh,
share
was
that.
that was up around 26 Mile Point when they got run over by that boat,
They
right?
were southbound, right?
They were southbound, and they somehow got tangled up with the cooperative spirit and sank. Yeah, I remember that now. I do.
Well, that
I
leads
don't
me.
know anything about it, but
Well,
I
it
remember that.
it leads me to my final question for you this evening. You mentioned uh, just now some of the difficulties of establishing passing arrangements southbound below Geismar. How important is that communication, and um, what sort of challenges might you face with the ship pilots and with other heavy tows coming northbound?
Well, it's a matter of life and death making these arrangements, you know, and you've got so much traffic on the radio that sometimes you're not going to hear the communications from the other boat, or you're going to have to keep trying until you get it. And everybody can be confused, about what exactly you're going to do. And if you've got a ship drawing 35 or 40 feet, a ship with a keel, you know, and weighing, 120,000 tons or better, he's going to have different navigation requirements than a big raft of barges. They both got. I mean, not that either one of them is easier. No, they're not, but they require a different river in a way. You get a ship, and we try to work with one another. If I've got a ship behind me somewhere coming down behind me, and I can get him around before I have to drop down and flank 81 Mile Point or something, I will try to my best to do that because he can't stop and tread water like I can. I can stop and tread water. It may not stay there. It may go all kind of places, you know, but I can. I'm a little bit. I've got flanking rudders, and he doesn't. I mean, he's just got the one wheel and rudder. So when he backs up, it's going to go one way or the other, and it's going to turn around. He can't stop. He can't. And so, you've got different requirements, and you've got to try to work with one another if you can. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes traffic is so heavy, and they do have a traffic control now. They used to have it at Governor Nick, down there at Greater New Orleans Bridge around that area, and they still have that, but they have that all the way to Baton Rouge now. But those guys aren't necessarily they don't know what we need. They're just trying to keep traffic straight and prioritize who comes first or second and all of that. They don't always get it right, because most of them are not river pilots. Some of them are. You get, I think the ship pilots down in New Orleans frequently are hired, for that navigation system. Uh, so that's a little bit better, but it's so chaotic. It's so busy. It's so complex that there's not, you know, there's not a whole lot you can do. Which but that is part of the profession. There is working together and it's not as bad as it used to be. But you used to have, especially some of these guys out of the canal, you know, these small boats. They would have what they called a wheelman. He wouldn't even have a pilot's license. They only had the one captain on there and a pilot, the one licensed man on there, and the other guy was a deckhand. And if he was a smartass, he wouldn't do what you told him to do. He'd be in your way. And if you've got 30 barges or 35 barges and you're trying to steer, say, 35-mile point, you're trying to run over that point. You got your jackstaff up on it at least. And if you've got some guy coming around underneath that point, you know, 6, 7, 800 feet off the bank, man, you're pointing at him or behind him, and he's going to freak out, but you got to get off of him. And over here across the river, you got fleets, you got docks, you got a nuclear power plant, stuff like. I mean, you got all kinds of stuff that that it is. I'm so glad that I don't have to do that anymore. That's not a part of the job I ever loved.
Well, do any specific incidents come to mind that you may have witnessed or been privy to that were related to passing arrangements going awry?
Uh, oh, I'm sure there are. I can't think of any specific ones there. I've never. I don't think I've never stenciled anybody down there. But I know people you who we've been real lucky, you know, about that kind of thing. I think the whole industry has been uncommonly lucky that nothing serious has happened, because you've got cargoes down there that are, they're pretty dangerous. You got chlorine barges, you've got benzene barges, you've got, anhydrous ammonia barges. You don't want to whiff of that. You got oil bar. I mean, you don't want oil spills. I mean, we've been real lucky, and I've been real lucky myself. I was captain on a boat for ACBL, the old Richard C. Young. There were 3 boats down there with ACBL. Their job was to build tows, between, say, Myrtle Grove and Baton Rouge, and try to get them ready for the big boats. So that the big boats, we could turn the big boats, and they could get the tows and go on up the river with them, and we could take their big old tows down and dismantle them and deliver them to where they were supposed to go, and then begin to build others. And that's a miserable 2 years, because they, back in those days. Nowadays, some of these companies will reduce tow sizes, as safety factors. In those days, they didn't do that. You were gonna have 30 barges at least pretty much wherever you went, and sometimes 30 barges is on a 5,600 horsepower boat. That's a lot of barges, and you had to be right in what you do. And I worked on that boat for 2 years. Made me a better pilot than I was when I got there, but Lord have mercy, that was hard work.
Speaking of, Captain Chad Leeper is due on January 6th, his episode premiere. So the first Saturday in January. He's actually on the Dennis C. Bottorff in that turn trade, turning big
Oh yeah,
toes up and down. So I hope we get a chance to take a look at that one.
oh yeah, I will. I've talked to those guys. I towards the after I retired from ACBL, I tripped for inland. My old buddy uh, Victor Bateman and I worked together on several of those Ingram tow boats, and we worked down there some. So we got to know some of those guys. Yeah, they that's a pretty good operation down there. I built quite a few tows right there across from Triangle Reserve. You know,
Well, Cap, I think that'll do it here yet again. I thank you very much as always.
and my pleasure. Enjoyed it.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.